patches on our patchwork jacket are comprised of mitered squares. Now, a mitered square can be made many different ways, but the ones in this pattern are made with garter stitch and in 3 different yarns. We have our main color solid yarn, we have our flower power color changing yarn with 3 colors, and our granny all-in-one yarn, which creates this 5-color stripe. So to begin, we're just going to focus on how to make a basic mitered square, and we're going to start with the solid colors. So get your main color ready and let's go. To begin our solid colored mitered square, you need your main color yarn for your patchwork jacket. Today I'm using Red Heart Super Saver in light periwinkle, and the straight needles you need to get your pattern gauge. Now we'll talk more about gauge later, so don't stress too much about that. So the mitered square we're making today begins at the corner with just 1 stitch, and then we're going to increase along the center of each row, and that double increase I'm going to teach you is what makes each row turn a 90-degree corner like this. And then by the time we get to the end, this is actually 1 row, the 2 edges of this square. So let's get started. To begin, you need to cast on 1 stitch. So casting on 1 stitch is just making a slip knot. And now we're ready to begin. So our first row is a right side row, and on each right side row, that's where we're going to make a double increase. So for this very first row, the double increase is the entire row. So I've got my 1 stitch on the needle. I'm going to knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, all in that 1 stitch to increase 2 stitches in 1. So first I'm going to insert my needle and knit it just like you normally would. But after I pull through that loop, I'm not going to pull the stitch off of the left-hand needle. Normally you would do that and you'd have 1 knit stitch, but we're just going to leave that stitch on the left-hand needle. Now I'm going to work a yarn over. So I'm going to bring my yarn from the back of the work in between the needles to the front of the work, and that's going to create an extra stitch. Then I'm going to bring my needle back into that stitch that I already knit into. Now when I bring my yarn back to knit that stitch again, when I bring it to the back of the work, that completes the yarn over and creates a stitch. And then I'm making 1 more additional stitch by knitting into that stitch again. And there we have it. That is a double increase. I've taken my 1 stitch and turned it into 3. So that's the entire first row. We're going to turn around and knit our first wrong side row, the second row, and it's just knit. So knit all 3 stitches just as you normally would. Row 3, we're going to work that increase again, but the increase is always going to land right in the middle of the row, right on that center stitch. So for the 3rd row, you're going to knit 1, then make your double increase, which in the pattern looks like knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, and that's in brackets because it's all in the next stitch. So to show that again, our increase is knit into that stitch, but do not pull the stitch off the left-hand needle because we need it again. So you knit it, bring your yarn between your needles to the front of the work for a yarn over, and knit that same stitch again. So now I've turned 1 stitch into 3. And then that last stitch I'm going to knit. So at the end of row 3, you should have 5 stitches. Then I'm going to turn, and my 4th row, which is a wrong side row, is just knit all the stitches. So this is every second row, every wrong side row is just knit. So you don't have to pay attention, you don't have to count, You have to pay a little bit of attention, but it's a little bit of a brain break every second row. On the 5th row, we're going to mark our center stitch to make it easier to continue going without having to count before and after that center stitch. We are just going to mark it so that we can just knit up to that stitch and make our double decrease. So to mark your center stitch, you're going to need a stitch marker that is removable. So there are some markers that are just rings that slip onto your knitting needle that you slip back and forth, but you need something that you can actually slip onto a stitch and remove. So there are stitch markers like this. There's ones that look like this that lock, a little one like that. But you don't really need a fancy stitch marker. You can also just use a paper clip or a safety pin. Those will do just fine. So I'm gonna just pick one. We'll use this one today. So row 5, you're gonna knit 2. Make your double decrease. So we'll go over that one more time. Move that out of the way. Knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, all in that same stitch. Oops, there we go. So now I have 3 stitches. And now you can see those 3 stitches, they're all kind of connected at the bottom. So I know that is my double increase. And I'm going to mark that center stitch, the middle one that was the yarn over. And that's going to indicate where I need to increase the next time I need to increase. So there, I've just slipped it through the stitch and it's just going to hang to the front of the work. And that's also having it flopped onto one side of the work. Now I also know that this is the right side of my work when the marker is facing me, and that indicates that this is an increase row. So after I've done my double increase and I've marked my stitch, I'm going to knit the last 2 stitches, and that's the end of row 5. So row 6, like all the other even numbered rows, which are wrong side rows, I'm just going to knit. So we're up to 7 stitches now. So now the 7th row and the 8th row are the instructions that you're going to repeat over and over until you get to 41 stitches in a row. So let's start with the 7th row. Now that our stitch is marked, it says knit to marked stitch. Now the marked stitch is 1 row below, but it's still pretty easy to see that this marked stitch is right below this stitch on the needle. So that's the one I'm going to need to work my double increase into. So I'm going to knit into that stitch, don't drop it off the needle, yarn over, knit into the same stitch. I've made my double increase. Then I remove the marker from where I had it before, and I put it into the yarn over from my current row. There we go. And then knit to the end of the row. And row 8 says as second row, which is just knit. Every second row is knit. So we're going to repeat that 7th row instruction, that 8th row instruction, repeat 7, 8, 7, 8, 7, 8, until you have 41 stitches on the needle. So once you've repeated row 7 and 8 until you have 41 stitches, you're going to end with a right side row. So I've just worked an increase, I worked to the end of the row. Now I don't have 41 stitches, we're just going to pretend. It's time to cast off. You might notice that your work is really cupping up. You can see how 3-dimensional that is, right? But don't worry, it's supposed to be like that because our square, this edge is actually two sides of our square. And so that work is being stretched out on your needles, and the work is stretching and flipping out. But once we cast off, it's not going to be a problem at all. The stitches will relax and we'll have two nice straight edges. So you're going to cast off or bind off, whatever you want to call it, with a wrong side row facing and 41 stitches on the needle. So just a quick review, if you're an absolute beginner, to cast off, it says knitwise, so that means we're going to knit the stitches as we're casting off. So I'm going to knit the first two, 1, 2, and that first stitch I knit, I'm going to insert my left hand needle and I'm going to use it to pull that stitch up and over the other stitch and off the needle. And there I have cast off one stitch. Then I'm going to knit one more stitch until I have 2 stitches on the needle, and I'm going to repeat that. I'm going to take the stitch, the first one that was knit, and pull it over the second. I like to put my finger there just to stop that second stitch from slipping off as well. And keep on repeating that. You're going to have 2 stitches and then pull the first one over the second to cast it off or bind it off, and repeat that until you have just 1 stitch left on your needle. So now I have cast off all my stitches. I have just 1 loop left on my needle. Now I'm going to leave a long tail before I cut my yarn, and that's just so that I can use this tail for sewing the squares together later on. And then I can just pull that tail all the way through the last loop, and we're done. So there's my mini example mitered square, but yours is going to be 6 inches. Let's talk a little bit about gauge. Now, most of us hate making gauge swatches, which I totally understand. But the nice thing about this pattern is that because we're starting with these small squares, this can count as your gauge swatch. So each of your mitered squares should measure 6 inches. Now, this is very important for a garment to ensure that the final measurements of the garment match the final measurements in the pattern and fits you well. So to measure your square, make sure it's on a flat surface. Now, a rigid ruler would be better than a tape measure, but I don't have one that's going to fit on my camera screen here. So I'm going to use a tape measure, and this one is pretty much bang on 6 inches. So the needle size that I used for this is the needle size I should use for the rest of my squares. This is the first square I made that's actually, it's a little too small. It's about 5 3/4 inches. So I actually had to go up a needle size in order to get a larger square. So if your square is too small, go up a needle size. If your square is too big, go down a needle size. So let's count the stitches and rows of our mitered square just to double check our gauge. Here I've got my square on a flat surface. You want it to be flat so that it doesn't distort your stitches in any way. And then also a rigid ruler is the best way to count, because a tape measure can also flex and distort your count. So I'm going to count my stitches first. I'm going to place my ruler right on my swatch, and I'm going to pick a spot where I can get exactly 4 inches. I'm counting over 4 inches because our gauge in our pattern is given over 4 inches. And I'm lining up the ruler with the row, and I'm going to count across from my 0 point all the way to 4 inches. And I'm just going to count the top bumps of that garter ridge. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So that's perfect. It makes sense that my square is 6 inches because I've met stitch gauge here at 14 stitches equals 4 inches. Now I'm going to measure my row gauge. So the process is exactly the same as you're counting your stitch gauge. I'm just going to place my ruler across my rows like this, perpendicular, and make sure that you're squared up so that you're not distorting your count by having your ruler diagonal across your rows. And so I'm going to place it just about there. And remember, in garter stitch, each ridge that you see counts as 2 rows. So I'm going to count by 2s from 0 to 4 inches. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, and I don't quite have the next ridge there, so I'm going to say that's 27, which is the row gauge that's quoted in our pattern. So this is bang on. We've got a 6-inch square, and we've got 14 stitches and 27 rows. Now, if you're not getting 14 stitches and 27 rows, remember to change your needle size to try to get to the gauge quoted in the pattern and the size of the square quoted in the pattern so that your garment is going to fit just great. So what happens? Uh-oh, I've lost my stitch marker. As you're knitting along, you might find you lose your stitch marker, and then it's very difficult to identify if you're on a right side or wrong side row when you're working in garter stitch because it's virtually identical. Now, the column of increases does look a little different on each side, but if you're not familiar, you might not know if you're on an increase row or a plain row. So I'm going to show you a little tip to help recognize your stitches so you can figure out what row you're on. So first of all, you're most likely, hopefully, going to have an odd number of stitches on every row. That's great because that's easy to identify your center stitch. That's the first thing you need to do. So I've identified my center stitches here, and I've knit up to that center stitch by counting my stitches. So at my center stitch, I'm going to examine it pretty closely. So this is my center stitch. It looks very similar to the ones beside it, right? I don't see any real difference. The base of the stitch is coming out of one stitch. It's got the little, what I like to call a scarf across it. That's like a little purl bump. It looks the same. So I'm going to say that this was knit on the previous row, and now I need to increase this because it is not an increase stitch. It is a singular stitch, and now I know I need to increase that stitch. So now I am on a right side row. So I'm going to show you what it would look like if you were on a wrong side row. So here I have knitted up to my center stitch. So that is my center stitch. And if I look at this one very closely, I can see that the one beside it has that little scarf I was talking about on it. This one doesn't. My center stitch doesn't. So this is a yarn over. You can also see that this stitch, the center stitch, and the one beside it, they're all coming from this one loop. So this was my double increase from the previous row. So that means I don't need to increase this. This is an increase already. This is a wrong side row. So I'm just going to knit that stitch and put my marker back on so I don't run into any more trouble. So that's how you recognize the right and the wrong side of the work as you're going. Now we're going to make 3 colored mitered squares without switching yarns because we're going to use Red Heart Flower Power all-in-one yarn. Now this yarn was designed to be crocheted. The color changes happen at the instances where this Flower Power square changes. So when you crochet with the yarn, you get this. When you knit a mitered square with this yarn, you get this cool color blocking effect. So it's not just for crochet. Let's take a look at the yarn. Now I've taken the label off so we can really examine what this looks like. You can see that there's 3 colors in here. I've got the yellow, the light blue, and the dark blue, and they're in different proportions. That's why we get just a small amount of yellow, more of the blue, and more of this dark blue. Now, in order for the color change to happen in this sequence, as we're knitting, you need to pull from the center of the yarn skein. So we're not taking the end that's at the outside of the ball. You need to pull from the center. Now, with these Red Heart all-in-one skeins, it's usually very, very easy to find the center. And then you want to make sure that you are at your first color, which is the yellow in this case. Every different colorway is going to be slightly different, but you are going to know that color 1 is the color that is the smallest proportion in your ball of yarn. So find your end and make sure you're at color 1. You're going to want to leave a tail before we begin of about 8 inches. Let me get my tape measure of that first color. So you can see I've got the color transition right here from the dark blue into the yellow. And I'm going to measure right where that yellow starts, about 8 inches. And that's where I'm going to make a slip knot and cast on the first stitch of my mitered square. Then, let me just get my yarn in the right position. We're going to work a mitered square exactly as we did with our main color solid yarn. So, just as a very quick review, the first row is an increase row and it's the right side. We're going to work a double increase. So knit 1, do not slip the stitch off the left-hand needle, yarn over by bringing it between the needles and to the front of your work, knit into that same stitch again, and now we've made 3 stitches out of 1 with our what we're calling color 1, the first and shortest color section of our all-in-one yarn, all-in-one flower power yarn. The second row is just knit. Every wrong side row is just knit, as we did before. My third row is knit 1, then my increase, knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, all in the same stitch, and knit the last stitch. We're going to turn it around for our fourth row, which is just knit. And I'm going to get you to the end of this color section so we see what happens. Row 5 is where I'm going to place my marker. So I'm going to knit the first 2 stitches until I'm at my center stitch. I'm going to make my increase, my double increase, by knitting 1, yarn over, knit 1 in the same stitch. Then I'm going to grab a stitch marker. I've got a different one today. I'm going to place that on the center of those 3 increased stitches, which is the yarn over. I'm going to clip that in place and continue knitting my row. That's row 5. I have 7 stitches on the needle now. I'm going to turn that around. I'm on row 6, which is just a plain knit row. So nothing is different here from our solid colored square. We're just going to manage the color changes as best we can to get the results we want. Okay, now I'm on row 7. I'm going to knit to my marked stitch. I'm going to make my increase. And here's a little tip. If you find it difficult to place the stitch marker after you have completed the increase, you can actually place the marker as you're making your yarn over. So bring your yarn to the front, scoop that marker on your yarn, and if it's not too fussy, then make your second knit back into that same stitch again with the yarn over, and your marker's already in place. Just make sure you have it positioned at the front, the right side of your work. Okay, now I'm going to knit to the end of the row, and now you can see at the end of row 7 here, I can see my color changes coming up. I can see it transitioning from the yellow to the light blue. And let's see if it lands in the right spot. So that's why we leave a tail of 8 inches. That's just to attempt to get the color change to land at the end of a row. So here's the moment of truth. Is it going to work? Here is row 8, which is a plain knit row. Oh, wow. I'm actually a little surprised that worked out so well. Look at that. And now for my next row, row 9, the new color is going to be blue. And well, let's knit row 9 and we'll see what it looks like. So that's an increase row. So I'm going to knit to my marked stitch with my new color, and I didn't have to cut the yarn or weave in any ends. Okay, here's my marked stitch. I'm going to take my marker off. I'm going to make my increase. I'm going to place my marker as I'm making my yarn over, just like I did before. There's my yarn over, knit back into that same stitch, and I'm going to pull that yarn over to the front of my work and knit to the end. And look at that color transition. It's just like I picked up and used a different colored ball of yarn, but the yarn just did it for me. Now, is this going to happen guaranteed every time? No. Everybody knits a little bit differently. Everybody's stitches are going to be slightly bigger, slightly smaller. There's all kinds of variables for why your color transition isn't going to land exactly at the end. And that's not really a big deal, because if you take a look at a completed square like this, so this color transition happened, you know, at the beginning of a row, but not exactly at the beginning. And here we've got a little color blip here where the transition happened, but I really don't mind that. I think that looks kind of neat. And this slightly irregular color change is going to prevent having to cut the yarn and weave in a lot of ends if you were using 3 different colors of yarn. So I would rather have slightly irregular color changes than having to weave in all those extra ends, but that's just me. If you want to try to manipulate the yarn to get really clean color changes, I'm going to show you how to do that next. Now, if your first color transitioning from color 1 to color 2 is not clean because it didn't happen right at the beginning of a row, this is the easiest one to manipulate. Later on it gets a little trickier, but this first one, because you're dealing with a yarn tail, you can just leave a shorter or longer tail at the beginning before you put your slip knot on the needle, casting on your first stitch. So for my square and in the pattern, it says to leave a tail, and I'm going to find where the majority of the yellow begins here, of 8 inches. So I would put my slip knot here. Now, if your color change happened earlier than you wanted it to, you need some more yellow yarn. So maybe just leave a 6-inch tail. And if your color transition happened later, leave a 10-inch tail. So that's an easy way to play around with shifting where the color transition starts and stops between your first and second color. So here I am at my second color change, and it didn't work out so neatly as my first color change. I lucked out there. So I've worked 9 ridges, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and that would complete my 9th ridge. And there's a guide in our pattern that says that the color changes approximately land after you've knit 4 garter ridges, which they did here, and then 9 garter ridges. And then the third color will be 7 garter ridges, including the cast off edge. So my color change happened in the middle of the row. So I can live with that, which I think is just great. I don't mind that it's in the middle of the row. But if you want to try to manipulate it, I'll show you how to do that. So if I look at it from the side that was facing when I knit this row, so this is a wrong side row, I had a little bit of the light blue, the second color, and then it changed to my dark blue. So if I wanted the dark blue and the light blue, if I wanted the color change to happen at the beginning of the row, I would need this section here in the light blue to take up a little more yarn. So the stitches would need to be looser. If I wanted the color change to move over here, and I would need more of the blue yarn, so I would need these stitches to be tighter to take up less yarn, so I would have more yarn to get to the end of that row before the color change. So the easiest way to do this is to change needle sizes. Now, if you're an experienced knitter, you might be able to just pick up your yarn and loosen and manipulate your tension as you go. But to be a little more controlled, to loosen your stitches, go up a needle size. To tighten your stitches, go down a needle size. Now, you might be saying, well, isn't this going to affect the gauge of my square? Yes, though garter stitch is pretty forgiving. It's a very stretchy fabric. So if we're only doing that for a couple of rows, it's going to work out pretty even without worrying about changes in tension. For week 1, knit all of your solid colored mitered squares with your main color, which will be 3, 4, or 7 squares depending on the size you've chosen. You'll also want to complete 12, 14, or 16 3-color mitered squares in your Red Heart All-in-One Flower Power yarn. That's it for week 1. Happy knitting and see you next time.